Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to New Books in Economics, a podcast channel from the New Books Network. I'm Peter Lawrenson, an associate professor of economics at the University of San Francisco. My guest today is Scott Cunningham, professor of economics at Baylor University. He's just published a new textbook with Yale University Press. It's called Causal Inference, the Mixtape. So you might think it's a little bit weird to talk about a textbook on a podcast, and maybe you're starting to think you should skip this episode and get back to that true crime podcast you've been following, which is a little bit more exciting. But stick with us for a minute and see how it goes. The book itself, of course, gives you lots of equations and statistical code, but we're going to stay at a high level and talk about the big points of like what causal inference means, why it needs its own textbook, some of the intuition behind how these techniques work, and some examples of what we as social scientists have learned from them. Also, as you may have heard, the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics was recently awarded to 3 experts in this area, so this is another chance to learn what all the excitement is about. So, Scott, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Peter.
I think, it's great to have you. I think everyone knows that correlation doesn't imply causation. I mean, you probably learned that even back in elementary school in some basic science class. And maybe people have also heard that randomized controlled experiments are, the so-called gold standard if you want to really link a cause with an effect. But so what is causal inference? Why aren't experiments enough to get the causal inferences we need?
That's great. So causal inference is kind of more of like a contemporary phrase that kind of groups together a particular attempt at getting those estimates of causal effects. You could think that causal inference is actually maybe really, really old because humans have been interested in trying to understand causal effects for a long, long time. So when you say something causal inference, it really is describing more of like a school of thought that's emerged over the last 40 years, or depending on how you want to draw it, maybe longer. And that's where the Nobel Prize winners are kind of connected with that. And causal inference kind of starts from that approach. It starts with a basic philosophical conception of causality, and it's an idea called counterfactuals. So let's say that I want to know the effect of getting a college degree on my wages. Then under the counterfactual tradition, if you want to call it that, to know what the causal effect is of that college education on my wages, I would need to know my wages in a world where I got a college degree. So say 2021, Scott Cunningham, he's got a bachelor's degree, observe my wages. And then I would have to know my wages, Scott Cunningham, 2021, same point in time, but in a world where everything else is the same, except that I did not get a college degree. And so, only one of those things actually happened, and that's fine. That the point of this isn't just to kind of tell stories. The point of this is to say, philosophically, scientifically, we think that is the most that is the correct way, or that is the consensus amongst philosophers of science and scientists and social scientists. That is the consensus of how we are going to approach this idea of causality. We're going to say that a causal effect is the difference between two states of the world. One where something did happen, look at the outcome. One where that thing did not happen for the same units. And that when you
how do we compare? Yeah, how do we compare reality to this fantasy land that never happened?
Exactly. That's what. And so it's funny that when you go through and you start with a counterfactual definition of causality, it's very pessimistic, because basically what it says is that you can't know any causal effects because you can never know the counterfactuals. I'll never know what my wages would have been had I not gotten a college degree, because the only thing I did do was get a college degree. So if I have to know both to know a causal effect, then I'm in trouble. But what's interesting is that notation, like that mathematical representation of the problem, actually offered the solutions. because what it did was it began to show that things like with groups of units, if you couldn't do it for the individuals, you couldn't do it for Scott, but if I had groups of units and I randomly assigned college, well, then actually you could show it very easily that the differences between the groups that got the college degree and the groups that didn't, that they would be equivalent on average in every single way, except that one of them got a college degree. And that difference in wages between the two groups, you could actually make a convincing statement, or you could trust that the difference in wages was because of the college degree. You could trust that the differences in the groups actually was the causal effect of college. And so it was really kind of an important thing in my reading of it. We've always had it. Scientists were running experiments for a long, long time. It was in the early 20th century that they discovered the importance of physical randomization. That was really the breakthrough from the perspective of causal inference, is that physical randomization had the ability to identify these causal effects, not just having a control group, but having a randomized control group. Well, that's great, and that's always true. But the problem is that in a lot of the social sciences, political science, economics in particular, epidemiology, and even in some of the physical sciences, astronomy, you can't really run a lot of physically randomized experiments. Like, we don't randomly assign people into college itself. We don't randomly assign countries into different kinds of political regimes, right? Like they tend to be happening, but that like they happen, but we're not randomly doing it. And yet they're very, very important. They're extremely, extremely important questions to know, what is the effect of college on earnings, and what is the effect of, some sort of political regime or some sort of public policy. So what happened is that, causal inference is just simply a set of tools that try to exploit that basic idea of randomization. They try to look for naturally occurring randomization in the world, and then use that to back out those estimates about whether or not things could be attributed to college or could be attributed to something else. And so causal inference was essentially it's sort of a building on top of that basic foundation of what physical randomization does for us, and then begins to kind of move incrementally away from it while still sort of maintaining that basic structure about thinking about it in terms of counterfactuals and how to get proper counterfactuals estimated.
Okay, well, that's a great intro just at the very high level. So why don't you plunge in and give us an example of a major study that illustrates like one of these techniques in action, and sort of to give us a sense of like how it works.
Sure. So let's see. So I have a paper where with Manisha Shah. And one of my areas have research has historically been sex work, and there was an event that happened in Rhode Island. Rhode Island in 1980 had tried to update its laws about sex work, and they were trying to make punishment of street prostitution more efficient. And so they went through and they rewrote their laws. But in the process of making their laws very focused on street prostitution, they accidentally legalized indoor prostitution. They basically gutted this entire section of the law and then took out all the parts that were general prohibitions and then just made it specific about street prostitution. It didn't really matter because for most of arrests have historically been on street prostitution, so it didn't really affect arresting. It also didn't appear to be that anybody knew they did it. There's no record of broad knowledge that it had even happened, that they knew that it had happened, and it never really got challenged. But then in the late 90s and early 2000s, there was a wave of of Korean immigration into Providence, Rhode Island.
Mm-hmm.
And accompanied with it was certain individuals that were starting Asian massage parlors that would provide illicit sex work. And they began to be arrested by the Providence police for prostitution, but they were arresting them for violating street prostitution. And it went to a judge in 2003, and a judge ruled that surprisingly, the state did not have any laws prohibiting prostitution. They just had laws prohibiting street prostitution. And at that point in 2003, police were no longer allowed or able to arrest any indoor prostitution situation. And so from
Mm-hmm.
2003, there was from 2003 to 2009, there was legalized indoor prostitution. So Manisha and I learned about it, and we took advantage. So this is a typical kind of causal inference thing. It's as though there was an experiment run. It was as though there was a quasi-random assignment of legalized sex work to Rhode Island in 2003, because it didn't happen for any reasons that were related to like votes. It didn't happen because of general trends. It wasn't like there was growing desire for legalization. It was just literally a judge's discretion as she interpreted the law.
Right. So there's, just to clarify that for the audience. So like you could think of like sometimes people, I actually was talking about this with my students in a class. Sometimes people will refer to something as experiment, like California is experimenting with legalizing marijuana, or some, other state maybe experimenting with decriminalizing sex work or something else. But of course, that kind of experiment is not an experiment in this randomization sense, because the whole reason that place is willing to do it is because of changing social attitudes or something else that's going on that made them willing to like actively make the change. So if any human is actually deliberately making a choice to make the change, then you no longer have something that you can really call an experiment.
Exactly.
In the sense we're
Or
looking
a
at here.
randomized experiment.
Yeah.
Exactly. Right. And that's kind of actually interesting what you saw. You can see that explicitly in that mathematical notation of counterfactuals. Like I was saying, it's really, if you're a social scientist, you can immediately see why this is going to be a problem when you're using laws, which is if ever there is a change in a law that is happening for reasons that are related to the expected gains from the law, it will basically, create problems for the experiment. And so, and usually that's what is happening. Places are changing their laws for reasons that are directly related to what they think is going to happen. Nobody's flipping coins, with minimum wage laws. And so, to try to find these situations where it really is disconnected from the expected gains from it are really valuable, because what they do is they allow you, maybe sometimes for the first time, to even answer that, even offer a credible attempt at an answer for those questions. And so Manisha and I, we spent a long time. We interviewed a ton of people in Rhode Island, in the police department, in hospitals, working for various parts around the city, trying to understand what's going on, collected tons and tons of data, and just used it to study the impact that it was having on sexually transmitted infections and violence against women, as well as entry into the market. And, what we found was that against common beliefs, we found that the legalization caused violence against women to go down, and we found STDs to go down. But the challenge is still, you always still have to find a comparison group. And ultimately, what is interesting about causal inference, in some ways, it's really, really simple. It's always really, really simple, because the fundamental definition of causality is really, really simple. It is just a comparison between you and your counterfactual. So that's all the causal effect ever was. It was always just, what was the causal effect of college on earnings? Compare me to myself in a different reality. But so that also means that the solution is going to be is going to have simple forms. It's just going to mean that you're going to have a credible estimate of who my counterfactual is going to be. Who is my stand-in Scott Cunningham going to be? Because that Scott Cunningham or that Rhode Island doesn't exist. That Rhode Island in after 2003, had the judge not made that decision, that Rhode Island is gone, and it does not exist. So
just to clarify the setup of this particular study, you're saying that basically before 2003 it was illegal because everyone involved, even though maybe on paper interpreted the right way, it was legal, but in practice, police were able to arrest people, and the women and men working in this business all assumed that it was illegal, just like it had always been and like it is everywhere else. But just when this judge made the decision, then all of a sudden kind of a light bulb went off, and like everyone's like, okay, now it's legal. You can't do anything to me.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so one of the methods in causal, so without physical randomization, all these statisticians and econometricians and social scientists had to essentially create alternative, methods that function equivalently like randomization to eliminate those underlying contaminating bias problems that come from using stand-ins that aren't randomized. And so we used a method that does that. What it did was it basically found a group of states that looked just like Rhode Island over a 20-year period of time, year to year, in terms of violence and STDs, that mapped it year to year. So, like, their average violence rates, their average arrest rates, their average STD rates. We found a weighted average of other states that looked just like it. It was
why a group of states rather than just like find one matched state?
Well, typically, actually, you'll never find a single state that functions all that well as a stand-in. So you and I, we might even be twins, but over the course of our life, our wages might, you got a job one summer waiting tables, and that's the summer I decided to, take an extra class at school. And so any one person oftentimes doesn't function very well as a perfect match, but lots of times groups can, because the errors of any one person kind of starts to cancel out a little bit. And so the groups will be a little bit more stable. And so, this method that we use it was two methods, one called synthetic control and one called difference in differences. They both find a weighted average of states that are one of them just says take all states and be a weighted average. That's difference in differences. And the other one says find the best states that look just like Rhode Island. It lets a computer find who they are, finds exactly what those weights needs to be optimally, and then groups them together, and then just tracks them over time, and then tracks Rhode Island over time. And the difference is meant to measure the causal effect. And it's funny when you say it out loud, you look at the actual statistical technique, and it's very intimidating. And all of these things, once you can kind of break them down, aren't nearly as intimidating as they seem at first glance. It's real. Lots of times the methods are versions of trying to find weighted averages of other units. It's just that sometimes those methods are the weights correspond to certain groups of people and others. But anyway, that's what we did in this one. And that's a good example. I think that is a good example of one where you're never going to randomly assign legalized sex work. You're never going to randomly assign you're not going to randomly assign Medicare. You're not going to randomly assign Social Security. And yet these are really, very, very important questions for the sheer, importance of how many people's lives depend on them, for good or for bad.
Right, because even if you say had some groundswell of support for, say, legalizing sex work, you'd do it for the whole state. We wouldn't just sort of pick like we're going to do these towns and not these towns, or these states and not these states.
That's right. Yeah, and lots of times there's winners and there's losers in things, and so trying to figure out, like things like average effects and is important. And if you can target policies where some of those negative effects aren't going to those groups of people that are being harmed by it, those are all obviously more efficient and more equitable too. And so, trying to answer these questions in the social sciences when you can't run these physical experiments, physically randomized experiments is really important.
So you mentioned the difference in differences as one of the techniques used here. So why don't you just to explain to people more about that? Like, tell us why. Like, so let's say my naive thing would be like, okay, well, sex work was illegal up until I think you said 2003, and then after that it was legal. So let's just look at like, does violence against women go down?
Right.
Why can't you do that? Yeah.
So let's say that there's a surge of COVID that's happening in the United States, right? Surge of COVID happening in the United States. COVID mortality happening in the United States, growing, and then there is in California a mask mandate that's imposed, right? And if you were to look at the average mortality before the mandate in California and compare it to average mortality in California after, it will absolutely be that after the mandate, mortality is higher because it's on an upward swing. And that's the whole reason that they got the mandate in the first place, is because it was growing.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what you typically can't do in these kind of like before and after simple differences is the things that you need to be true in order to do those simple differences between, like forecasting kind of style differences, is you need for there to be no time dynamics whatsoever. There can't be any underlying time trends that are happening. Otherwise, to get an unbiased estimate. Otherwise, the treatment in the post period is just all tangled up with those time trends. And so what you're and sometimes that's fine. Sometimes, with highly disaggregated data, high frequency data, I think you can find before and afters that are very convincing. And I think like with a lot of the data that we had during COVID, data showing things like the impact that COVID mortality had, that distancing rules had on people, moving around and being in, basically firm, going to restaurants and things like that. If we saw pings from cell phones, that seemed to happen pretty quickly, and it was really easy to kind of say, I do think there was a causal effect, because those time elements were sort of almost being eliminated just because we're tracking down to the seconds. But like,
so that's kind of this discontinuity thing, right? So if we all start putting on masks and that reduces the rate of spread, whatever effect that is going to have is going to take a week or two to play out. Whereas you're saying if you actually have like the cell phone data and like, here's the day before the lockdown or the mask mandate, and here's the day after, and you can see huge changes in behavior. That wasn't just the trend.
Exactly.
That probably was just that day, right?
Exactly. And so with like very they call it high frequency data or disaggregated data by time and things like that, I think a lot of those before and afters actually become almost like trivially, obviously causal. Like there's just no other explanation than that. The second they put the mask mandate on and you saw that immediately, then you cause it. But sometimes the problem with that is that not everything happens immediately. So and that's kind of the problem, is that some stuff happens slow. Adoption happens slow. Vaccines happen slow throughout the state, and so you don't really have a sharp discontinuity that you can exploit. And so then what do you do? Well, so what you're doing in these differences, what are called research designs, they're basically difference in differences. The way to think about differences in differences is think of it as an alternative to physical randomization. That's in my mind, I kind of think about all these things as like separate ways of doing an experiment that does not use always physical randomization. Some of them do, but not all of them do. So difference in differences will not use physical randomization in order to address those biases. It's going to use something else. It's going to use something called parallel trends. And parallel trends is a belief that you have found a group of states or cities that were trending over time in exactly the same way as your treatment state would have trended had they not gotten the law. So if you're wanting to know, for instance, if you're wanting to know the effect of shelters in place on COVID mortality, and let's say that everybody's adopting, to make it simple, let's say that people are adopting shelters in place at two different times of the year. One's in March and one's in November. All right, just to make it simple. But and we've got cholera. I mean, we've got COVID mortality. So what you're doing with differences is you're essentially using a set of states that are not treated with the mask mandate as your control group, but it's more like you're using it as a control group in their change over time. So the control is actually the change over time for those states whose change over time is exactly equal to the change over time that would have happened in California had California not had a mandate. So let's say it's Texas. Let's say that Texas mortality would have gone up by 100. Let's say Texas does not get a mask mandate, and over this period of time that we're looking at, our mortality goes up by 100. And had California not gotten its mandate, if it would have also gone up by 100, then Texas is a great counterfactual, because they both have a parallel trend. They both are going up by 100.
So you just kind of subtract out that 100 to try to figure out what the leftover.
Exactly. You just subtract. Essentially, you just try. It's a version of that. You're just going to subtract out that 100, and you're going to basically say, well, what happened in California? If I take that 100 and I start at the starting point for Texas and I go up by 100, that's what would have happened in California. What actually happened in California is this. And so the difference between that projected counterfactual for California using our Texas control group, the difference between what did happen in California and what would have happened in California using Texas's trend is the causal effect. And so, a lot of the statistical models, no matter how sophisticated they get, of this class of approaches that are grouped as difference and differences, when you go deep inside the engine of them, that's what's in every one of their engines. Every one of their engines has a parallel trend spark plug driving the whole thing. And that's parallel trend spark plug. If you believe it's true, if you can provide some evidence that it is believable, and what usually people will do is they'll track how Texas and California's trends were like before. Were they always tracking before, just up to when the mask mandate happened in California? If they were before, people oftentimes feel a little comfortable using Texas as the control group, as the estimated counterfactual. If they weren't, then they don't. And see, you can sort of see here how a lot of these methods, they've been really used a ton during COVID. They have been used extensively in COVID. So there's like branches of work by scientists during COVID. There's clearly the biologists and the chemists who are working on vaccines and things of that nature. There's epidemiologists that are trying to understand, the population dynamics of the spread of disease. And then there's the social scientists who have been trying to evaluate not necessarily the vaccine, although some people have been studying the vaccine too, because that has been, politically a culture war kind of thing where people don't always agree. But they're also wanting to know things like, are the mandates working? Are these rallies? Are these political rallies? Are they causing more spread or not? And all these kinds of questions. These are hugely important questions. right? Like if political rallies are causing COVID to spread, and in turn causing mortality to rise, you can imagine the challenges that almost like constitutional kinds of challenges, because we protect we have amendments that protect getting together in groups to talk to sort of meet and discuss our views. And if that's killing people, we have a lot of hard questions we have to answer. So all throughout this, the difference in differences has been one of the most commonly used program evaluation methods to evaluate tons of stuff that has been going on, policies and rallies and things like that.
So you mentioned epidemiologists, and it does seem like, certainly for things like disease transmission, that's kind of their area. So how do they divide the labor between us and them, and do they use the same methodologies, us by being social scientists, where we think of like humans as the main thing versus like for them, I don't know how they think. I don't actually know how they class themselves. I think they kind of affiliate themselves more with the medical scientists in some respects, but they are studying social systems. So
Right.
like, how do those differ?
Sure. So it's funny that you asked that. I didn't even think to mention this. The epidemiologists are actually the ones that invented difference in differences. It was actually invented in the 19th century by the father of epidemiology, John Snow,
Hmm.
who he invented a difference in differences method to provide evidence that cholera was being spread through the Thames River, and not via the air. Cholera is a waterborne disease, and so it's interesting that you bring that up, because it's deep in their DNA to sort of approach things this way, because as you mentioned, they're not just a biological kind of science. They're a social systems science of the interaction of disease and human beings living together. And so many of their theories kind of do map on biological processes with social interactions. So the work by the epidemiologists, I think we have never. I think the social sciences have never been had more close interaction. Uh, like between economics and epidemiology than they have right now. We're like in regular interaction with each other. Sometimes there's collaborations. There seems to be, some listening to each other and talking to each other, reading each other's papers, arguing with each other. So I know that there is that there is a lot of collaboration in a big sense. We all have different journals, and each of the journals has different sort of standards in terms of like whether they tend to like certain kinds of methods over others. But actually, in both epidemiology and in the broader social sciences, it's all that same counterfactual based reasoning. So a lot of the basic core statistical concepts and those things of that nature, they're the same. A lot of the same methods are the same. Uh, and So I think right now there's a lot of mutual interest in the same questions and mutual interest in valuing the same policies. But I haven't really followed in detail a lot of the COVID papers. And so, there's too many to follow. So I don't know exactly where all of it sits, what it would be considered the best that's come out of the epidemiology program evaluation at this time.
Hmm.
So I'm not sure.
Okay. Yeah, no, it's great that, yeah, it has been definitely a lot. We've all, I mean, whether social scientists or even just ordinary people, everyone's kind of an amateur epidemiologist right now. So
Yeah.
hopefully we're all learning something from them. And I think there's been some territoriality at some points, but
Yeah.
some, hopefully also some mutual exchange and learning among specialists who are kind of discovering similar things or using similar tools in slightly different settings.
Yeah.
So another, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Well, I was just going to say, it's funny if you think that there is returns to experience and there's returns to learning stuff, then obviously epidemiologists know a ton about disease, and obviously, other social scientists, economists, and sociologists and political scientists know a ton about evaluating public policy, and so it's bound to be, as we both try to study the same thing at the same point in time, it's bound to be kind of contentious, when you think about it, because we all have sort of specialized in our comparative advantage, and yet this particular moment has all of us working on the same thing, and so there is probably going to be some territorialism, and there's going to be like intense criticisms of one another because there'll be both obvious mistakes and just very, very deep disagreements with each other over how we're approaching things. And I guess it just gets settled out, in time with who ends up, who what the consensus is about who's been right or wrong.
Right, and I'm sure there'll be usually some kind of convergence in some respects. So let me ask you another question I had about also kind of about cross-disciplinary exchange. Economists generally use a lot of software and know a little bit of programming, but don't tend to intellectually engage directly with computer scientists. You have a whole chapter in your book devoted to discussing ideas by the computer scientist Judea Pearl. So what is that about? Why did you feel like that was necessary? And what was coming from that?
Well, Judea Pearl is actually, probably one of the most important, bordering on being a philosopher almost. I mean, he's one of the most important people in the history of causal inference, in the history of the entire field of it. He just entered into it through a back door of artificial intelligence. And he started out in artificial intelligence, trying to build, systems for these, systems to think and to sort of be a thinking system requires making causal conclusions all the time. So you have to make causal deductions constantly. If you see a door, that the doorknob, you know what it is, you recognize it, and you know that when you turn doorknobs, doors become unlocked, right? And then you can pull on them. And there's all kinds of causal deductions that you're having to make, both kind of prediction stuff and then also classifying but then making causal predictions. And you're not going to be able to have a robot constantly running randomized experiments. And so Pearl, with some of his students and co-authors, developed an entire calculus, essentially an entire branch of mathematics that gave a kind of probabilistic framework for doing causal inference. And it actually does map directly onto that counterfactual tradition. And so it fits directly into the traditional work that these three economists won the Nobel Prize for. David Card, Josh Angers, and Hino Embens is not in tension with them at all. And so I brought it in because that framework, the book is really about doing causal inference without being able to physically randomize. And Pearl's work is absolutely essential to doing it, because what it does is it shows that, if you have a deep understanding of the thing that you're studying, you can use that information to actually solve a lot of those bias problems through carefully selecting certain types of approaches, and maybe even certain types of approaches, let's say, become clearly suggested when you have prior knowledge that you can bring to the problem itself. So Pearl was he's a hugely important person in causal inference, and he actually helps show a path to how we can go about non physical experiment solutions to causal problems.
So I haven't had time to read his work closely, aside from just reading your chapter and then hearing discussions of it by economists. I guess my sense from that, and from a little bit of very shallow Twitter discussion, is he seems to think that the economists are doing everything wrong, including
Yeah.
the Nobel Prize winners. And the
Yes.
Nobel Prize winners seem to think that he's actually got this whole complicated thing that he's developed, but it doesn't really add anything that much to what they're doing.
Right.
So help me. So you just made it sound like we're all collaborating in this together, and
Yeah.
hooray! But that's not the perception that one gets
That's
from
definitely.
interacting
I
with.
don't know though exactly if the disagreements are always happening at the same level as it might sound. At the fundamental level of like identification, there's a mapping back and forth between proofs that you get from uh, this potential outcomes counterfactual based theories of identification and Pearl's work, and he discusses that, and others discuss that too. The the there's a lot of equivalence between things. Where things become different is whether in practice I am going to need to have as much information as Pearl claims that I'm going to need to have to identify a particular causal effect. And so Pearl seems to speak as though I can't identify any causal effect unless I have a system of equations that completely describes um, the data generating process associated with all the variables in my data. And the question becomes, how can I, with confidence, if I find specific sources of physical randomization, if I find specific sources of physical randomization that are only focused on one thing, how 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 believable, is it that I can focus just on that without having that full picture having already figured out? And lots of times that is where the disagreements seem to be coming in. And so sometimes when you listen really closely to the debates are not being had always at the philosophical level that I think Pearl prefers to have the debate. It's usually getting down to the nitty gritty of actually doing empirical work, and people that are doing the actual empirical work who have actually found true sources of physical randomization. I think that they are saying that they are identifying causal effects, even though they have not generated a huge diagram of all the relationships between all the variables in the data. And Pearl sometimes I think doesn't really engage with the deep specifics of an actual empirical project. He is not an actual empiricist.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes I feel like, what I would really love to see Pearl say is, here is this paper. Here is this paper, this synthetic control paper of the legalization of sex work in Rhode Island, right? Or this masking paper. Okay. What is the problem with this paper? What is the problem with this paper? Is there something wrong with this paper, or are you making a general statement about the importance of prior knowledge in identifying causal effects? And so some of those disagreements that you see on the internet, they are, about half of them are like just people talking past each other.
Mm-hmm.
They're not really engaged on the same questions. Now, whether or not Hito Embens and Yuta Pearl have fundamental disagreements with each other, I'm sure they do have fundamental disagreements with each other. Just like, but it's not. I mean, lots of people in this tradition of causal inference have fundamental disagreements with each other. Jim Heckman, another Nobel Prize winner, has fundamental disagreements with Yuta Pearl or Angus and so forth. So it's not just Pearl or Angus and Embens. So there is like, deep, discussions about how much structure has to be brought to a question before it can be credibly answered. And when and on those questions, I don't really completely know how to summarize those. Those are very complicated, deep statistical debates. Uh,
Mhm.
but but ultimately, I think there is more in agreement between Pearl and this group than there is in disagreement. And I feel like sometimes there's these unnecessary debates that are just going to push people from even being able to read each other more profitably. So I tend to feel like the disagreements just dominate all of the conversation, and there actually is a lot more agreement. I think everybody would agree. I think Embens would agree that to estimate some causal effect, I've got to make some assumptions, right? Like parallel trends. And
Mhm.
where do those assumptions, why should I believe those assumptions? Pearl would say, well, you believe them based on prior knowledge that you have about the way those policies were chosen. Okay. Then I've learned tremendously that Pearl kind of gives me the calculus, start thinking really carefully about how I'm going to go about selecting who is and who is not going to be my control groups. I've got to think really carefully about how those laws were chosen. Um, and so I find them to be, complementary. And that's why I put them in the book. But I guess
Yeah,
not.
no, I can see. I mean, in a sense, it sounds like maybe Pearl is he's almost like. I mean, the complaint at any at most economic seminars is that everyone wants to tell you that your results aren't really identified, and you're not good enough. And it seems like he's even more, maybe even more, putting the perfect as the enemy of the
Yeah.
useful than the average uptight economist.
Yeah.
But then, of course, for those of us who actually are trying to contribute to practical questions, then it's like, well, is this well, I guess maybe, it depends on the person. Some people go into the seminar with guns blazing and say,
Yeah.
no, I have a perfect identification strategy. The other kind of weird habit economists have is talking about like things like this is plausibly exogenous, which
Right.
is kind of like there's a judgment call about whether this is really, good enough to be like random, but I think it's good enough that, my results probably give us some information. And it kind of
Yeah.
gets into the whole thing that like at some level we're all kind of naive or informal Bayesians. It's like we
Yeah.
see a few
Yeah.
different studies, none of which are perfect, and they kind
Right.
of lead us to say, okay, maybe, this is what would happen with,
Yeah.
a change in sex work, or maybe masking does or doesn't work. But it's
Yeah.
never it's never as conclusive as it could be in anyone's mathematical proof, where you exactly knew that these assumptions are unquestionably true.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
yeah,
I
yeah.
also kind of think, it's funny. It's funny. Like when I was younger, I always just kind of thought like we were all just trying to get the truth out. We all just cared about the truth. But as I get older and I learn how science works, um, it's like you're always trying to convince people. You're always trying
Hmm.
to uh, Pearl, not being an economist, has to convince people that his work is relevant and has to be taken seriously. And he may have to take an approach to be louder than anybody in the room because he's a computer scientist that he wouldn't have to do if he was an economist at MIT. And
Hmm.
so it's entirely possible that the only reason we even know about Pearl is because he has to exaggerate and focus on the dissimilarities because he's creating all these fights all the time. That's sometimes what I wonder is this strategy of always being so aggressive. Maybe it's been the right one because I'm reading him and
Hmm.
I'm getting angry about it and talking about it. Whereas if he was just being polite and just kind of saying, well, maybe you're right, maybe this, it would have never gotten past being in some computer science conference. But to get it to really get over, to really get people's attention outside of the field, sometimes you have to go like really really far. And so
Hmm.
maybe that's part of it. um, I do think he is important and really really important to read, and economists don't read enough of him.
Yeah, I do think, I mean, in a sense, like people, like I said, from whatever in high school, I'd at least heard the phrase causation doesn't imply, or correlation doesn't imply causation, and could think of examples that like helped me understand why that would be true. And but I do think that it's great the way the field of the first time I learned econometrics, it was just sort of, well, you plug these different numbers into a regression and you control for this because you've got that thing, and now economy, in the social sciences, at least economics and political science, which I know there's much more of the starting point is this counterfactual of like what is focusing on one treatment as opposed to just like, well, we throw a bunch of things into the regression and then we if we have enough controls, we're okay. um, and then I think, yeah, so it does seem like Pearl's work and kind of drawing out these diagrams is at a minimum very useful for helping reinforce the intuition of like why your counterfactual may not be counterfactual, how sort of your inferences could be contaminated,
Right.
and pushing people to do that. I
Yeah.
want to bring back to, and just to also maybe reinforce something you said earlier, which I wanted to follow up on, about how when you were doing the study on Rhode Island, you went there and you talked to a bunch of people.
Yeah.
So let me give the, just as a devil's advocate view, like if you're an economist and you're a stats guy, why not just gather the data and then analyze it? Why did you go around and spend so much time talking to people?
Well, I mean that actually is because I had read so much Pearl. To be honest, I was convinced that you really can't. Josh Angrist and Alan Kruger, they have this article. Josh Angrist won the Nobel Prize. He and his co-author Alan Kruger had a paper on a method called instrumental variables. And there's this part of the book of the article where they say the best instrumental variables, which is kind of like a shorthand for these particular kinds of natural experiments. Let's say the
Hmm.
best instrumental variables come from deep institutional knowledge. So they're not like you just download a data set and you just start running regressions, and it's like the hardest thing to teach a student, honestly, is to teach them that's not the way you do research, is just download a data set and start running regressions. You need, and Pearl, I felt like taught me that too, which was, if I want to do this experiment, I have got to figure out, uh, what the market for sex work was like at that time. Why did this law get, did, what was the policy in 1980 actually enforced in 2003 for the first time? Right? Or is that just a story that I'm telling? Just because some
Hmm.
journalist said that doesn't mean it's true. And there's you're going to provide evidence for that with data, and but you also, I think, have to talk to people, and you have to become deeply familiar with the thing that you're studying. You just won't know. You just won't even understand your data at all. You won't know what data to collect. You won't know what's garbage and what's not garbage, how to clean it up. You won't know some of that basic data generating process that you need in order to make assumptions, credible assumptions, to justify using a particular statistical model. And so, for me, qualitative research is pretty much all of my major projects. Before I went to grad school, I actually was a qualitative researcher. I did it for 2 years, doing leading and analyzing focus groups and in-depth
Hmm.
interviews. And so probably it's kind of like a personal like opinion that they're a really, really important part of the research process because of my background, but also because of Pearl. Pearl kind of convinced me of it too. And so did Angrist. You've got to know the thing that you're studying. So I think that isn't just. I don't think data tells stories. Let me say it that way. I don't think data tells stories. I think you make data tell stories. You just hope that the stories it's telling are true, and to figure out how to make it tell stories, you have to learn, you know, where what its language is, and you've got to learn, how to interact with the data in a way that brings out the stories that are in there, but that are going to require prior knowledge to know how to coach it out of the data. And so, causal inference is really all about using prior knowledge in a way to coach the stories out of the data, rather than just, naive plots, And so going and having, the combination of qualitative and quantitative schools of thought, I think are really, really powerful for getting at, really important questions that nobody has the answer to.
Yeah, I do think, I mean, even though causal inference in a sense is, being pushed forward and obviously developed by people who are very sophisticated statisticians, looking at the math of it, it's been great to see how also that kind of led people back to like, no, you've really got to understand, what the data scientists call domain knowledge, as if it's this
Right.
exotic thing, right? Or the data generating process, which is, what people in the social sciences for centuries have said,
Yeah.
walk around and talk to people and make sure that what you're doing makes sense before you
Yeah.
just start, throwing stuff into your computer and getting that old, garbage in, garbage out kind of results.
Exactly.
So this is, I think, is a great point to end on. So let's just say again, you've got this. Actually, so why don't you promote everything you got? So you got this textbook that has just come out that presents a lot of these ideas in a very accessible way.
Yeah.
And I think you have some other projects going on. Why don't you just take a few minutes to tell everyone
Yeah.
about that?
Yeah. So I have the textbook. There's a free version online at my website. If you Google Scott Cunningham called Economics, you'll find my website and you can get to the free version. It has it has programming code in 3 programming languages to illustrate all of the methods, and the code goes with data. So it's not just abstract code. It's all major programming languages so that you can implement these things and try to.
Which ones do you have?
Python, R, and Stata. And the Python and R are housed on a Google Collaboratory, so you can actually run it in a browser. So it's actually really nice. I have a Substack that I write about. I update about every 2 weeks. It's free. It's just a free newsletter. It's called Causal Inference, the Remix. And in it, I basically write explainers, kind of like Vox.com style explainers about econometrics, causal inference, and applied papers, so that people can kind of see, what these new methods. Part of what I see is the thing I would like to do more is to just be a bridge between econometrics and applied work. For those people that maybe don't want to spend all the time like learning it all themselves, I try to do it and explain it because I'm not an econometrician. I'm just a normal person. And then I've started a new thing where I'm going to be doing online workshops for actually for anybody. I'm going to be doing online workshops that you can come and take a class on causal inference. And so in mid-January online, there'll be a workshop I'm doing on causal inference. It's 5 days, 3 weekends, 5 days. Heavily discounted for students, pre-docs and post-docs, and it's a higher price for people that are employed, with the hope that maybe their employer or someone might pay for it. And then there's an advanced differences in synthetic control workshop in mid-February. And we're about to launch the website for that any day. But if you go to the Substack, you'll see when I post it. So I'm just trying to democratize as much of this causal inference methodology as possible, because traditionally data science has been very focused on prediction, which is kind of like a prediction of an outcome. And econometrics has been focused on a very unusually different kind of prediction, a prediction of a counterfactual, so that you can estimate causal effects, and they're not the same thing. And so what I'm trying to do is just continue to pump causal inference methodology all the time to more broadly outside of the top programs and the top school and the top firms, try to get it into the hands of like regular people all over the world and all throughout industry.
So are you getting people in industry from the more like self-described data science or business analytics kind of
Yeah,
sector
yeah,
studying yourself? That's
starting
great.
to. Yeah, that's what I'm starting to do. So
Yeah, that's
I feel like obviously like places like Amazon and Google and Facebook, they have huge departments of people that are well versed in causal inference. But as you move further and further away from that core, the level of in-house built-in knowledge amongst those machine learning groups, it's not as common. And so because it's not always in causal inference is not in a lot of the terminal masters data science programs, first of all, and they don't always, and they're not always hiring the people that do have that, even if they do have PhDs, because the difference in differences and synthetic control and instrumental variables oftentimes is not taught. It's not part of the toolkit for a lot of those workers. And so I'm just trying to create classes online that will be accessible to people in industry as well as students. I just heavily price discriminate so that students aren't paying very much.
right. No, that's really great that and really interesting that you were able to do that, and having the textbook and all the code online for free, but still selling the print one, and doing the price discrimination. Discrimination is a dirty word in a lot of contexts, but I think all the students who are getting your labor and input, which would otherwise fair market value would be beyond what they could afford, I hope will really appreciate it.
Yeah.
I guess, and I'll just plug here since you mentioned your thing. So go to Scott and get your exposure to this. And if you have more time and you want to do a 2-year master's program to learn more about how economists, both about how we think about markets, that core theory stuff, but also learn about causal inference in a program where you start out with learning Python and R and concurrent data science tools and machine learning, but also having that causal inference perspective and the economics framework incorporated from early on. That's what I'm spending my time on over here in San Francisco. And of course, if you want to work in the digital economy, San Francisco is kind of a nice place to be. Especially now that we can all go out of our houses and actually meet with each other, and now the streets are, filling up again with people who are fascinated by these topics and heavily involved in them. So thank you so much, Scott. This has been super interesting. I was going to try to keep it short, but I couldn't help myself, and I hope thanks to all the people listening who got this far. I hope you're as fascinated by it as I am, and will read Scott's book or join in one of his seminars. So we'll sign off here.
Thanks a lot, Peter. It's nice to chat with you.